So Halyard is a tool that you use to update Spinnaker. So this allows you, it has a command line and you can access it to apply the changes to the deployment, whether you want to add another connection to maybe something like Jenkins, or you want to set up a connection to a new Kubernetes cluster. You do that through Halyard. In the next session, we'll talk about Operator, and Operator interacts with Halyard, and that really greatly improves the installing configuration process. So stay tuned for the next session. Okay, so we've covered the architecture. So now let's get into the tool, right? Time check, we're doing great. We're just in the first 10 minutes. So as if you look at the UI of Spinnaker, you've seen projects, applications, you've seen pipelines. And as my colleague Andrew explained, projects are basically a dashboard, right? Where you can group together your applications, and you can view the execution of pipelines from those applications. You can choose which applications, and then from those applications, which pipelines to include in a project. But it's all about having a page on the UI where you can see all the history together, right? That's what a project really is for. And then application, that construct is what is basically contains your pipelines. There's many pipelines you can have within an application, and it's really up to you what makes sense, how it maps to what you are using Spinnaker for. Does it make sense that an application represents your application, or does it make sense that your application represents a microservice? That is really your call. Spinnaker gives you that flexibility. But at a high level in Spinnaker, an application will contain your pipelines. Usually it's associated to a Git repo. And like I said, it's up to you how you want to map it to your applications or microservices. And of course, you have the pipelines, which we're going to talk about in more detail now, right? But it's usually a set of stages, a set of steps, where you're usually calling an API of another system to do something, right? So when we talk about pipelines, the first thing that we have to talk about is about triggers. And triggers, of course, are what automatically executes a pipeline. And this can happen through various methods, either through a Git push, it could be through a Jenkins build completion, it could be when a new artifact is pushed to a Docker registry, and this can be a public registry and also a private registry. So if you're using something like Nexus or Artifactory to store your Docker builds, as soon as you publish an image to that, it can trigger a pipeline. So those are your binary repositories as well, like Nexus Artifactory, webhooks, and there's other means that you can automatically execute a pipeline. As part of your pipeline, you can also define parameters and expected artifacts. So the idea being that parameters are values that you're going to pass during pipeline execution, and those values will be available to the pipeline throughout the execution. So whether it's a variable to an environment, whether it's the tag of a container, those can be defined as parameters. Parameters can also be passed as payloads. So if you decide to use something like a webhook trigger, you can pass those parameters as JSON as well. What expected artifacts allow you to do is define artifacts that you'll use the execution of the pipeline. So for example, you may have maybe deployment YAML. So you can define it at the beginning as an expected artifact by the artifact provider. And that could be your deployment YAML you may use throughout your pipeline execution. Next, let's talk about stages. So again, stages are those set of actions, right? So some actions, as you've seen today in the first two labs, are about bake and deploy. So when I think of baking, you're talking about either Kubernetes and you're talking about Helm, where we got to take the Helm charts and bake them into deployment YAMLs, or we're talking about images like EC2 or Google Cloud or Azure. We can also deploy to, of course, Azure, AWS, Pivotal Cloud Foundry, Spinnaker has a lot of cloud drivers, Alibaba, Hawaii Cloud. I couldn't name them all, but I don't know them all at the top of my head. And as Chad mentioned in the previous session, a lot of these are contributed by that vendor or in partnership with somebody else like Netflix. Other type of stages available are manual judgment. So if you want to stop the pipeline for somebody to say yes, continue or stop, you can run Jenkins jobs, which allow you to also access property files. So if you want to run a Jenkins job, do something, and there's something of value, maybe a digest of a container that you want to pass back to the pipeline, you just put that in a property file, and Spinnaker will see that. And you can also have a stage where it calls a webhook. And if you are going to do that often, you can also define a custom webhook. So for example, you want to create a ticket in Jira, or you want to create a ticket in ServiceNow. Those are simple REST calls that you can make. But instead of just saying webhook, you can create a custom webhook called create Jira ticket or create incident in ServiceNow. And they're just calling a REST call behind the scenes. And of course, these stages, you're going to arrange them in sequence. And there's a stage called check precondition. So if you want to branch a pipeline, you can do that. So based on a value that maybe is returned, you can decide whether you want to go ahead with the deployment or maybe create an incident in ServiceNow or create a ticket in Jira because maybe there's a problem that we need to take a look at and halt the deployment. So when it comes to deployments, you can limit those to specific maintenance windows. So if deployment should only happen, Friday nights, or maybe Monday at noon, I don't know, whatever your windows are, you can limit so deployments only happen during those windows. As I mentioned earlier, Cloud Driver is managing your deployments. And those deployment targets are going to be configured based on accounts. So in Kubernetes, it could be a service account. It's all based on those accounts. So when you go to deploy, really an account maps to that deployment target, if you will. And that's how you're going to access those cloud resources. And that's how Spinnaker is able to orchestrate deployment to various cloud providers, right? If you give me a service account for Kubernetes and EKS, a service account for Kubernetes in on-premise, right? Those are all just accounts to Spinnaker, and Spinnaker treats them the same. Just a note about infrastructure. So Spinnaker does give you visibility into the infrastructure along with the applications that you deploy. So by this, I mean the infrastructure that is produced as from code, correct? So if it's a Kubernetes deployment, you'll see the deployment object. You can go into the YAML definition file. You can look at the pod. You can look at the load balancer. If you deploy to EKS, you can look at the service and the details as well as the task revision. If you're deploying to, EC2, et cetera, you can see the image and all its details and networking as well, like load balancers. So Spinnaker gives you that visibility. So those are kind of the constructs that comes to building pipelines in Spinnaker. So for the rest of the time, I was just going to give you a quick demo. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. At this point, I'd like to kind of show you what Spinnaker UI looks in action. So we'll do that through a demo. This demo that I'm going to show you, it's using Spinnaker to orchestrate or process various different tools. So I'm going to show you how you can have it set up to accept pushes from GitHub to then, have access into Jenkins to build jobs, maybe create changes in ServiceNow, in Jira, and then deploy to Kubernetes that's actually running on AWS. So I'm switching now to Spinnaker, the UI. So here I have an application defined, and here I have 2 pipelines defined. So the build and deploy, I'm going to show you how the application is defined, the specific pipeline. So under configuration, I've done 2 things. One is the deployment YAML that I'm going to use to deploy. I'm defining that as an expected artifact, which I talked about in the slides. So now, from now on, when I do a deploy stage, this is available to me. So I don't have to redefine the deployment YAML each time, right? It's in source code. Next is the automated trigger. So it is a GitHub repository I have. So whenever I push a change, that kicks off the trigger. When you trigger a pipeline, that trigger can pass information to the pipeline. So for example, if it was a trigger from Jenkins build, the build number would be available to me. Since I'm doing it through a git commit, the hash, the commit hash is available to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and I'm going to assign it to a variable. And then I'm going to pass that to Jenkins. So that way Jenkins will build, will do a checkout based on that hash, do the build of the container, tag it, and push it to our registry. The registry is inconsequential. It's Jenkins is doing that, right? And then after that, we get that build number. And again, just using environment variables that I'm going to be injecting into the deployment YAML. The build tag to put in the YAML, and as well the namespace, which in this case is going to be dev. So here I'm showing you how you can use spell, which is the Spring expression language. It's very useful in Spinnaker to take information that either is made available by any of the stages or the triggers and use it later in the pipeline. So it's a very powerful feature that I think there's a lab tomorrow or maybe later today that goes more into it. But it's very useful as a good practice for visibility in the execution history. If you assign them first to variables in this stage, after you execute the, the pipeline, excuse me, you're able to see the values. The values that it's showing me right now are values from previous executions. So I know whether I need to change this. But I know there's a whole session on this, so we'll continue. So we'll assign these variables. Whoa, that was loud. We'll deploy to dev. And here I'm using my account Spinnaker, just into the Spinnaker cluster. I have a namespace dev. Sorry about that. Using my deployment definition file. And I could check this box if I want to do blue-green deployment, but I'm just keeping it simple right now. So I deploy to dev, I do a manual judgment, and then this is an example of a custom webhook, which can send variables to ServiceNow, right? So maybe ServiceNow is your source of truth, so that the digest for the Docker, the registry for the Docker container can be stored there, as well as the commit hash, just for record keeping. So let me run this really quick. So let me just go into here and let me do an edit of my file in that application. We'll add some exclamation marks. We'll commit. So then the pipeline kicks off. There's a new commit hash down here. Now it's going to Jenkins to build a container. So if I go to dashboard, what can we do here? Where we can see it's building right now. Just going to create a property file, which is going to contain the digest of the container. So you can see the property file is able to read it, which gives me the digest, sends the property, and now it's deploying it. And from here, I can see the deployment YAMLs. So this is build 60. So if we go to infrastructure, we should see build 60 coming up here soon. 59 was the last deployment. So we'd expect 60 to come up here soon. There's 60 coming up, so it'll start scaling this guy down, 59. So as we talked about earlier during the other labs exercises, this is the infrastructure view. So I'm able to see the deployment objects I mentioned earlier. So here's my deployment. From here, I can delete it or scale it, undo rollout, you know, my actual version, my replica set, and my actual pods. So let's go back to the pipeline. So in the pipeline, I have a manual stage. So here you can use spell as well. So you can provide a message that may have dynamic values. So here we'll say, sure, everything looks good, let's continue. And I will create a change in yours, whatever system of record it is. In my case, it's just ServiceNow. I just happen to know that. So I'm going to log in here. It expired, my session. So we did build 60. So I was on build 59. If you can see 59 right here, that was the last time I did. So if we refresh the list, we should have 60 here. There it is. So I created this ticket with build 60, which now we have a record of the digest, the Docker digest, and the git commit hash. But there may be other values that you could put in your system of record, whatever that is. Spinnaker allows you to do that because you have the webhook that you can pass whatever you want in that payload. And then in ServiceNow, You can do buttons, which allow you to run basic scripting by calling a URL back to Spinnaker. So this is what this will do. This will send a webhook back to Spinnaker, and it will include these fields for another pipeline. So I click on this button, and then if I go back to Spinnaker, I'll see another pipeline executing, which this one takes the field values from the ticket, mainly the tag and the digest, and I set the thing to prod. And then I'm gonna check the call set Jenkins job, which checks the digest of the ServiceNow ticket versus the digest of that label, of that tag, just to make sure. And then based on that, it'll keep executing. So now we are 25 minutes up to the hour. So we're running pretty much up to the hour. Are there any questions or anything else about Spinnaker? Anybody here that anything that I can help clear up when it comes to Spinnaker? You know, such a wide subject.
Hey, Fernando, I have a question.
Yes, please.
So you actually trigger from Spinnaker based on a commit, right? So is it possible to trigger Spinnaker based on a PR? So let's say I'm do a PR against of like a GitHub, and it triggers Spinnaker, and Spinnaker triggers Jenkins. Because right now, the way how I do it now, I actually like, you know, have git pull PR plugin connect to Jenkins, and once I raise PR against a kind of like a branch, it actually, you know, trigger Jenkins, and Jenkins triggers Spinnaker and pass property files. So I'm just curious because I don't want to make a commit. First I want to test my commit. So
right. So when do you want to do the build? When Git does what? A push of a PR when a PR is approved and merged, or?
No. Yeah, when you raise PR against some certain branch, right? So it will actually notify Spinnaker that there is a new kind of like PR Git commit. So, and it will trigger obviously like Spinnaker trigger like, you know, Jenkins, and go through all of these steps.
That I don't know. I don't know if anybody else in the room would know, or on the Slack can help us answer that question. I know when it's a webhook under the scenes, that's what GitHub is sending to Spinnaker, and the webhook is set up on push events. So unless we can, I don't know if Spinnaker is even set up to listen to webhooks that are for when a PR is raised, and I don't know if there's a webhook when a PR is raised.
Hey,
yes?
So yeah, this is Justin. So one of the features that was recently added to the specifically to GitHub is that you can configure, or to the GitHub integration, is that if you configure GitHub to send pushes on a PR creation, which is an event type in GitHub, then Spinnaker can trigger a pipeline based off of that. So it is possible.
Oh, okay.
There's a little bit of work that, there's a little bit of work to get it working, but yeah, it basically grants you access to the branch name, or I believe the branch name, and also the the repo, and then you can use that however you want in the Spinnaker pipeline.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I do actually when I'm sending this payload to Jenkins right now, because it actually creates event based on a PR, and it sends all this information to Jenkins. But yeah, I would rather, for example, send it to Spinnaker and use it in a later stage, like extract this information, you know, like a git commit and all kind of stuff, instead of just getting them from Jenkins.
Yep, that is possible. I don't think we have time to cover all of that today, but because it does take a little bit of time to set up, but it's possible. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin, for jumping in. Appreciate it. Any other questions? Anybody else have any questions before our next session? I have a lot of people here that know Spinnaker, so take advantage of it. I see some questions. I'll check the chat. Okay, I see that. Justin, thank you for answering the questions in the chat. So it looks like questions are being answered. Okay, well, let's just conclude my session then. I'm going to stop sharing. and I will remain here in the room. I'm just going to put myself on mute. So if you have any questions, just let me know. Otherwise, thank you for your attention. And thank you for joining the Spinnaker Gardening Days. And thank you for all of our sponsors and everybody that put so much hard work into it. Thank you, everybody.